Campfires on the beach are a memorable and long-celebrated tradition of a Cape Cod summer. First Encounter Beach is one of the best places to see the sunset over the water on the Cape. This year, we are unable to gather together for such an event, but are still able to celebrate this tradition through selected stories and speakers commemorating the 400th anniversary of the first encounter between the Nauset people and the English who ventured to this beach on December 8, 1620, in search of a place to settle. 400 years later, those of us on Cape Cod still face many of the same issues. What is it like to be an immigrant here? How do the native people feel about our presence? How have humans impacted this area in 400 years, and how has the landscape changed? Please join us this summer as we explore these issues and the lore of Eastham over the years since this first encounter. You can find these campfire programs on the Eastham 400 website, posted every Sunday night in July and August. Thank you. Welcome to the second in the series of Eastham 400 campfire programs. Tonight we have a presentation from Mark Adams, the geographer and geoscientist of the Cape Cod National Seashore. His project is Landscape Change on a Coastal Peninsula in the Gulf of Maine. He will relate how the coast has changed on Cape Cod in the last 400 years.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be speaking to Eastham and the world through this little digital campfire. As John said, I work for the National Seashore as a geographer, cartographer, geoscientist, and I've worked with many fantastic people who are, in fact, I'll bet many of you in the audience are experts at certain aspects of the things I'm going to talk about, so I'll give you credit. If you were in the room, I'd be asking for a show of hands. But I'm really excited about this information because we often look at science and the shaping of the landscape as these kind of abstract systems, but we also know that people are a big part of shaping the landscape of Cape Cod. And it's a very dynamic place. And from my opening slide, I'd like to emphasize that we need to zoom out and see Cape Cod as part of this bigger geography. And the Gulf of Maine is a system in which we sit. The Cape Cod is the southern end of the Gulf of Maine, and it's kind of a little bowl on the shelf, on the continental shelf in the North Atlantic. And there'll be a lot more about that as we go along. But again, I want to do a shout out to my collaborators at the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown, Graham Geis and Mark Borelli, to Bill Burke, the seashore historian, and to many others. So, I'm going to just briefly review how Cape Cod came to be, which many of you know this story. The glaciers that were here retreated in several lobes. You can see that the little form of Cape Cod between two lobes of the glaciers that retreated over the last 20,000 years, leaving this kind of stub of an arm of Cape Cod as of about 6,000 years ago when sea level rose to current levels. And we had this glacial peninsula that actually is not the edge of the continent. The edge of the continent on Cape Cod is in the center of the Atlantic Ocean, the mid-Atlantic ridge. That's where the ocean is spreading and where the real action is. But we live on a passive continental margin, which is a shelf, a platform with this continental crust and this really wonderful dynamics supply of sand that's moving back and forth with waves and tides and creates our beaches and dunes, and in some cases results in erosion. In some places it results in building of beaches and landscapes. As the ice retreated, it also left marks on the plains of Truro, Wellfleet, and Eastham, and kettle holes that became ponds or dry kettle holes. This is, as I referred to before, this is the 22,000 record of sea level rise that is the background for the creation of Cape Cod. But if you look closely in the last 2,000 years, you see how stable it has been after that 120-meter rise in sea level as the ice melted from the glaciers. And then currently we have a rather accelerated sea level rise, but nothing compared to this past history, in which we have about a foot a year is our background rate of sea level rise on Cape Cod. 3 millimeters. I'm sorry, 3 millimeters per year, which comes to about a foot per century on average, and that is probably accelerating with changes in global temperatures and sea level that are a result of that, result of many factors. But here we are again in the Gulf of Maine, and Cape Cod is still changing all the time, and the biggest drivers of this change of the shape of the coast are waves that come from the south over Georges Bank and from the north within the Gulf of Maine, from Nova Scotia and such. But as sea level rises over Georges Bank and it becomes shallower and shallower out there 100 miles off, that barrier to ocean waves allows more and more waves to come in. And so the waves are pushing Cape Cod northward. They're eroding more and more from the south, more and more from the beaches of Chatham and Orleans and Eastham, and maybe a little less from Wellfleet and Truro, and that sand is then being dropped off in Provincetown. This is a story that many of you may know. But you may not have seen some of these dramatic pictures of it. So here's the plains that really extend from Truro to Wellfleet to Eastham, and all of this glacial material left over that is being carved out as the waves run up to the cliff edge and carry that sand along this river of sand along the shoreline and create our beaches. If we didn't have erosion, we wouldn't have beaches. It's as simple as that. The erosion supplies the beaches with sand, and the sand is constantly on the move. And here we look north in Truro, and we see where some of that sand is going in these bars that become deposited in calm weather and weld to the shoreline. And here's a view of Cape Cod from the 1779 atlas, the Atlantic Neptune, one of the famous early atlases of Cape Cod. And what I love about this is what a mariner would have seen from the ocean as they approached Cape Cod back in the 17th century. I recently went to Mystic and saw, actually this was a year ago, I went to Mystic and saw the Mayflower 2 being reconstructed, and we were scheduled for a visit this year, which I guess hopefully that'll happen in another time, but it's interesting to put that in context of the arrival of humans in this dynamic landscape of Cape Cod. So there's 4 main factors that drive the changing landscape of the Cape. There's these ocean effects. Storms and weather are part of that. There's fire, which has always been a human-caused shaper of the landscape in the forests of Cape Cod. And then there's land use, which is us. Land use is, the dividing of the land into woodlots, the building of Cape Cod cottages, the days when there was farming, when there was asparagus and turnips, and that mark on the landscape from agriculture, from land use, is still there. Although, as I'm going to mention, well, let's get to that later. But I always love some of these historic pictures that show people in the landscape. And you just wonder, we bring our expectations to a place. We bring these kind of civilized expectations. And was the place made for all of that? Where does, this is, I think, from the Penniman family, one of the women from the Penniman family. And, the Pennimans in Eastham were great lovers of the outdoors. Aside from whaling, they ranged over the landscape, and there's wonderful pictures of them enjoying the place. But you think, this is not how we dress for an adventure in the landscape these days. But, it reflects a relationship to the land. And then, just briefly, a few images of the classic kind of dawning of the period of Cape Cod artists with Edward Hopper's Cornhill and these bald hills of grass that, question, would they be considered natural? This is a wonderful image of the old South Meeting House that was like a ship in the night on the completely sculpted landscape of the hogback ridges of Truro. and then the salt evaporating pools and windmills that were, constantly consuming more of the wood and stuff to create salt, and then some of these kind of landscapes, which are actually, if you read Henry David Thoreau and his descriptions of the vast desert, the vast moorlands of the Cape, and how a person could appear as a giant on this horizon because there's nothing to compare him to. These were very artificial landscapes. This is not what nature created at Cape Cod. But I have a few pictures here. One of the now in let's see historical comparisons. There's the railroad at Fisherman's Road in North Truro, and the railroad was a big driver of the fires that kept the trees from growing back. After this long period of agriculture, there was a period of abandonment of the Cape, where agriculture was no longer viable, but we still had the railroad spewing embers and starting fires every day. And if you read the old town meeting reports, you see that the railroad paid the towns an annual fee for all the fires that they caused in each town. The bottom picture is 1992, the same view, and only in our current generation, have the trees started growing back on the Cape. Here's a little sketch of fires that I found in some of the records across the Cape. A lot of them, one of the big red one in the middle there, I think, burned all the way from South Truro to North Truro and the only damage was a couple of chicken coops. You imagine nowadays what's in the path of a fire that big. But back then there were no fire breaks, and now we have lots of roads and fire breaks, even though we have lots more trees to burn. The other driver of these landscape changes, once the landscape was cleared, is the winds. And so we have a couple of wind roses here showing, this is the winds in March coming from the northwest, and that corresponds for that time period of when there were no trees to the orientation and direction of the parabolic dunes in Truro and Provincetown. And you can see here a scientist delineated the ridges of those parabolic dunes and showed how they moved over the centuries, driven by wind, since there was nothing to hold them down. So there's another beautiful view of the parabolic dunes of Truro, and that very natural form, that mathematical form that the dunes take on when the winds are allowed to take over and move the sand freely. So I want to just mention there's these historical periods of landscape change on Cape Cod. The period of native settlement, which humans arrived on the Cape 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, a very nomadic lifestyle, and gradually forming settlements that may have been camps and became semi-permanent. But their main effect on the landscape was some fire, some light burning below the trees that allowed them to hunt and allowed them to grow their corn in mounds, but really just a light effect on the landscape. And then the colonial period, which I call the colonial industrial period, when everything was used. It was a very utilitarian landscape. Everything was used and somewhat depleted, including ditching and draining the marshes, deforestation, etc., salt making, even the glass industry. And then from 1950, really it took that long. It took a century of abandonment before we had trees growing back, in spite of every effort to plant trees and to try to restore the forests of the Cape. But now, if you look from the air, we kind of have the closest thing to the pre-colonial forest that we've had in 400 years. Now we have a closed canopy forest. We have wildlife re-inhabiting Cape Cod with the abundance of foxes and coyotes, a few fishers. We had our bear visit a few years ago, and I think that's a harbinger of the repopulation of the Cape by nature. In spite of our communities, the development, the many, many houses, we need to constantly remember that we're living with nature, and that as nature comes back with us, we need to adapt to that, which includes handling our trash, using water very consciously, treating wildlife like it is wild and not feeding it, all kinds of things. And also, I'm going to make a note at the end of this talk about some thoughts I have about the future of Cape Cod landscapes, where it's going to go. So I want to focus now on a couple of locations where we have some historical record, and it's kind of a rich story. And again, it weaves together the humans with the forces of nature. Champlain, who was here in the early 1600s, left a really amazing record of maps and drawings, and really documenting the folk culture and the lifeways with all of the plants and animals on the edges of his maps, and the very particularized individual view of the native people that he met when he was here. And some of his encounters didn't go so well. There was definitely maybe a lack of sensitivity to this very established and rich culture that was already here. But we are very thankful to Champlain, for leaving these maps behind. And here's a map of Nauset Marsh from the Champlain record. And even though it's not to scale, it's really has a lot of landmarks that we recognize today, and that are clues to how both the native use, the pre-European use, and how things have evolved today. So here we are. Here's our Nauset Marsh Google Earth image, and here's Champlain, and here's Google Earth. Those marsh islands, the changing spits of Nauset Marsh. These are dynamic processes of landscape shaping that have been going on ever since, and they're not new. Also, there's this wonderful marsh barge boat that's at the Salt Pond Visitor Center, which is an example of this, indicates the use of harvesting salt grass from the marsh islands. Quite an intense use. Here's let's see, this is probably from the 60s, from about the time period that the seashore was created. Salt Pond and Nauset Marsh. This is looking west across Salt Pond. I don't think the visitor center was built yet. The golf course is there. Lots of agriculture. You can see the field boundaries. That famous golf course, the Nauset golf course, which was really quite famous, but very much suited to the pasture landscape of the Outer Cape at that time. Again, here's Salt Pond before the visitor center. And you can just see, trees starting to grow. Again, the 60s is about the time period. Actually, that might be, I think that was earlier. That was the 40s. Now here we are in the 60s, and at the time of the establishment of the seashore, trees growing back. The Salt Pond Visitor Center, when it was completed, right about the establishment of the seashore, and this nice arrangement of modest pines and oaks around the visitor center that allowed for expansive views. And then here we are sometime in the 90s, where now it's sort of a struggle to keep that view open and to maintain that expansiveness. We're a little nostalgic for that openness. So here's the Three Sisters in about 1892, I think, historical photo of the original Nauset lights. And let's see, oh my goodness, I'm trying to remember the exact dates on these, but the original Nauset light before it was moved. And this is, again, before the move. This would be 80s, I think. And on this map, I've shown the, the current location of Nauset Light and the original location of the Three Sisters. This dramatizes this erosion of the glacial cliffs, which is about 3 feet per year throughout the Outer Cape, throughout the coastal plains. And again, as I said, as sea level rises over Georges Bank and we get more waves, that will increase. It already is increasing in Eastham beyond that 3 foot per year. Let's see. And so here's a little summary of those changes. You can see the original location of the Three Sisters and their current location down the road a piece. They're about a half mile down Nauset Road. And let's see, the original 1960 beach parking lot and the current one, which, the shoreline, there's a couple of lines there showing the 2018 bluff edge, which is right at the edge of the parking lot. And there's already some of those parking spaces which are closed off as the bluffs retreat. This is, as I say, a natural process. And let's see. I just want to say that one of the things we're very lucky about is that in the 1890s, we had a coastal surveyor from the National Ocean Service come, Henry Merendon, and he came and surveyed the coastline in the 1890s. We use his measurements now to give us a 120-year record of how those cliffs are retreating, along with Graham Geiss of the Center for Coastal Studies, who arrived here in the 50s. And he's the one who's sort of taught me everything I know about coastal geology. So we kind of stand on each other's shoulders and understand nature through this long history of direct connection with both data and passing along techniques. And now we use sophisticated GPS to do our mapping. Back then, he'd come on the train or in a wagon and buy lumber and build tripods and row dinghies and take depths with lead lines. But essentially, it's human observation that gives us these records. So here's another little case study, the pastures of Fort Hill. There's the Penniman family on an outing at Doan Rock. And on the, let's see, on the right, there's me standing on Doan Rock in 1992, surrounded by hardwoods, which is pretty remarkable. So let's see. We're going to zoom in on Fort Hill here. This is the Coastal Survey map from 1868. And you'll see there's Nauset Marsh and the Barrier Beach. And all of you can see field boundaries. And the yellow indicates the only areas where there's some kind of scrubby forest starting to grow back in the 1860s. The rest was all pasture and field boundaries. And I think the little purple spots are orchards. Okay, and then we can throw that over the aerial photograph and zoom in on, here's Fort Hill, the pastures of Fort Hill, which are a cultural landscape. We've kept them open. Again, here it is in the aerial photo showing the green pastures surrounded by woods and the extensive marsh islands offshore. And we map that with satellite imagery, with botanists who go out and sample the plants. And we work with both mowers and burning and stuff to try to keep that. It takes an incredible effort to keep a pasture open if you're not farming. And that's the paradox. We want these landscapes that reflect how the land was used, that it was an agricultural place, and that's one part of our aesthetic. We love it, and it's beautiful. But you can't just create an agricultural landscape without agriculture. So we do our best with mechanical means to keep those pastures open. But what we really need is cows, sheep, and goats. But somehow that doesn't work with our system at the moment. So I just have a couple more examples of landscape change and the historical record. The Old Kings Highway, which extends all the way from the canal to Truro, really. In looking at these coastal survey maps from the 1840s and 1860s and using our computer mapping methods, I was able to pinpoint some of the old woodlots that existed in the 1840s and to see what's happened to them now. A few facts about these woodlots: 40 cords of wood per year were what it took to maintain a household. And these woodlots, as anyone knows who's looked at the property lines on the map from the old days, the woodlots were divided sometimes from bay to ocean, and the wider woodlots, the bigger pieces of land, were because it was really poor quality woodland, and you couldn't really get enough wood out of it for a farmhouse. The really narrow woodlots, these long, skinny lots, were the ones that were really rich, really full of trees, and were able to support a family. Let's see. So I have some census information about families, and you can just imagine. So with the 1790 census, the number of families that lived in the plains of Outer Cape Cod, you would basically use up every tree just for household uses in a very short time. This is a view of these coastal survey maps. They're staggered in time from 1830s to 1860s throughout the Outer Cape. They're just wonderful resources, and a lot of your historical societies have them. Again, here's a view of the woodlots laid over an aerial photo. This is Truro, but you can see some are wide and some are narrow. And here's what I found by comparing the modern pattern of forest to the old woodlots on these 1830s maps. The areas in green are the woodlots that remained in the 1840s, and they're still reflected in our vegetation mapping from, this is from the 90s. The darker green are those woodlots, and you can still walk the old King's Highway in Truro. And let's see, I have a couple of examples. So some places along the old King's Highway, you'll see stands of oak on one side of the road and stands of pine on the other side of the road. And, nature doesn't usually work this way. So this is a result of basically plowing and burning around the woodlots that disturbed the roots and didn't allow them to grow back as quickly. So where we see oak, pure stands of oak, it's probably an area that wasn't plowed, where the soil horizons weren't completely mixed up by pasture, and that some of those stumps might be really, more than a century old. Also, the understory indicates this land use history as well. How brushy it is. Sometimes you'll see these the plants that occur in the open heathland grassland habitats of the Cape, like bearberry and Hudsonia, the heathers. If you see those things in the understory of a forest, it usually means that forest is very new and it was open land not so long ago. These multi-stem oak trees often means that tree was cut but not fully killed. So a single stem oak would be quite old, but these multi-stem oaks are often the result of coppicing, where the roots are quite old and each stem was cut as it was needed and allowed to regrow back. And then there's fire scars. There's all kinds of clues when you walk in the woods throughout the Outer Cape that tell you a little bit about the landscape that used to be there, and it wasn't that long ago. Okay. So I just have a few more examples. I love Great Island in Wellfleet because this is a little microcosm of all of the cultural uses of the landscape and the natural response. The marshes of Herring River, just like Nauset Marsh, were some of the first very attractive places for native settlement for the first people. Because it was an easy, in some ways it was an easier living to harvest those marshes for shellfish and fish, the seagrass, and the European colonists found the same benefits. But also, there's Great Island on that peninsula to Jeremy Point. If you don't know the map very well, it was an isolated place. And it was grazed. Here's a photo on the top from actually Brook Island. Let's see, that photo would have been from around 1900, and the same view in the late 90s at the bottom. And here's another, this is laying the foundation stone for the Bound Brook Island Schoolhouse, actually not the foundations, it's a memorial stone for the Bound Brook Island Schoolhouse. In about 1920, they put a marker out there, a bronze tablet on a stone. And in 1920, there still weren't any trees on Bound Brook Island. And the bottom photo is 1992. And you can just see me with my white notebook standing there at the site of that marker. Really remarkable that in such a short time, the trees came back. But this is an 18th century map from the Wellfleet Historical Society showing they really were islands. There may have been beaches and sand connecting them, but they were treated as islands, and you could let your sheep run on an island and not have to worry too much about how far they wander. And so it was heavily grazed. Another benefit of these islands was that you could sit on the porch of the Great Island Tavern and wait for reports of coastal whaling, of coastal whales. And when you'd see a whale near shore, everybody would rush out to their dories and make a fortune. There was this coastal whaling, that was accessible to the local community without going a couple years to sea. And let's see, there's another. This is the Atlantic Neptune, and if you look very carefully, you can see the Wellfleet Islands. Thoreau's hand-drawn map of the Cape with the islands. And here's Great Island. A current picture, just a few scenic, and the memorial to a Wampanoag woman. So this island has a long history of use, from native culture to the colonists and the whalers. Let's see, I want to get to so here we are today with the closed canopy forest, but you can see that this is a grassy hillside. This is near the site of the Great Island Tavern now. And there is evidence if you look closely, but these pine trees are not very old. These are 40 to 80-year-old pine trees. They're, narrow stems, small diameter, and there's grass underneath them, which indicates that this area was open not so long ago. And, this debris, which looks like a few rocks, is actually the evidence of all of these uses, all these layers of history on the site, while nature takes over. So here's my depiction of the Great Island Tavern from the description and from the artifacts that were reported by archaeologists on the site. And you can imagine this whalebone strewn around, and in the basement they had a gigantic whale vertebrae that was used as a chopping block for cutting and rendering all the parts of the whale, and a perfect vantage point to look off to sea. One more case study of landscape change that involves both cultural and natural processes on the Cape is the Pamette River and Ballston Beach. I call this the greatest hollow. Many of you may know that a Pamette is a geologic term, and that geologic term originated in Truro. The geologists that first described the Pamette Valley have used that to describe these glacial valleys all over the world as Pamettes. And the thing that makes the Pamette unique is that it's a wide U-shaped valley that's much bigger than the river that created it. And so it was probably carved by rushing water in major glacial events back when, at some point, as those two lobes of the glacier that I mentioned in the beginning impounded water and created lakes. So in Cape Cod Bay, as again might be well known to you, was called Glacial Lake Cape Cod for many centuries. And water melting off the glaciers accumulated so that in some cases it was higher elevation than the ocean. And similarly, on the ocean side, there was Glacial Lake Stellwagen. And those two lakes on either side exchange water through flowing back and forth in these valleys, these east-west valleys. And so we have a series of east-west valleys in the Outer Cape, including, Well, parts of the Herring River, there's Lombard and Paradise Hollows, there's the Pamette, there's Longnook. These are all east-west valleys that, again, were the result of water movement and glacial activities thousands of years ago. And then, as I mentioned before, we use these coastal survey maps to see where the remnant forests were. And you can see that patch of green forest, which is kind of part of the Truro uplands that existed in 1848. And you can also see those old Kings Highway woodlots to the north, towards the top in the lighter green. So this is Ballstown. This is Sheldon Ball, and let's see, I can't recall if his father had a part of this. But anyway, this is the original cottage colony at Ballston Beach. Shucks. And again, I apologize. I don't have the dates written down so much here. But this colony, aside from all of these cottages, there were recreation halls, I believe a bowling alley, the Pamette Road connected right through there. And let's see, here's something from the Provincetown Advocate. And if you go to Ballston Beach, you'll see a couple of these landmarks still there. But we just recently lost one of the last historic structures. Let's see, it was a little over a year ago, the shed that was just at the south end of Ballston Beach was removed, and it's actually got donated to Castle Hill. So Castle Hill has preserved that shed. It was one of the original boathouses of Ballstown, the cottage colony there. But this is sort of a tombolo, which is a dune connection across the head of the Pamette. And it overwashes regularly in storms. It retreats at that same rate that I talked about, 3 feet per year. And so it really just caught up. The natural 1,000-year rate of erosion caught up with it. And in 2013 and 2015, we had overwashes that took away that dune completely. Now, there's a lot of concern about that, but and one of the things, well, there's good and there's bad about this process of overwash at Ballston Beach and Truro. And the good part is it brings tons and tons of sand into the Pamette, the upper Pamette system, which will allow those marshes to keep up with sea level rise. So that sand that comes in builds elevation, and the marshes will grow back over that sand at a higher level, and the marshes won't be drowned by the lower elevations. They'll be able to keep up. And then what will happen to the dune? Well, as you recall from the picture of the waves coming in over Georges Bank and moving sand northward along the coast, there's this freight train of sand moving along the coastline with every tide. And that sand, in quiet times, will rebuild the beach and rebuild those dunes. And, you know, the dunes haven't rebuilt since 2015 at Ballston Beach, but the beach has gained elevation. And there are still overwashes, but so these overwashes, which seem dramatic in the last few years, actually occurred in the early 90s and in the 70s, and so it is a periodic event. But again, the system as we know it is a part of a process, and that process will recreate the landforms in time, as long as weather is not changing too much. I love some of these dramatic pictures. I use a timestamp on my cell phone. I have a cell phone application called Theodolite, which allows me to stamp each photo with the exact direction and coordinates and time. And it's a good way to keep a record and there's the big plume of sand that was driven into the system that is going to build into new marsh. It's also a really excellent beach nesting bird habitat. And, you know, there were concerns at the time. So this is one of the things we can do with our mapping is there are concerns about freshwater and saltwater, concerns about the wells and septic systems of residents. So we're able to map those. And from the preliminary mapping that I've done, most of those are well outside of the 100-year and 500-year floodplains of the Pamette River. There's still an issue with the tide gate at Route 6 that keeps salt water from going up too far into the system, and we think the system would be much healthier. I think the town is on board with looking at ways to allow the free flowing of tides under Route 6 up and down the river. And actually that will solve some of the problems with flooding that occurred in those storms, because if the river is returned to a natural free-flowing state, then when storm water gets impounded in upper river, it will flow. It will flow, it won't be impounded. Yeah, you can see that the center, the post office in the center of Truro there is right in the middle of this floodplain zone, which is something we might have thought about more a long time ago. I have a few more of these comparisons of old and new, historic and recent photographs. And these are all photos I took in the 90s from using these original archival photos from museum collections and such. And this is Horseleech Pond in Truro in about 1910, and with the forests grown back in 1992. This is actually from near the Gull Pond Sluiceway, and you can see a couple historic houses there in 1910, and then the view. In order to get this view, I had to climb, in 92, I had to climb on a roof with a ladder, set up my ladder on the roof of a house, and put my camera on a 25-foot pole to get a view over the forest. But this is the view that Thoreau describes as being able to see five ponds from a hilltop in Wellfleet. Really wonderful. Those landscape descriptions all the way back to Bradford, Morch Relation, and Thoreau and others. One of the sources of landscape description that I love most is not written by the Pilgrims themselves, but by a trapper. I think it's Thomas Morton, and he actually was married to a native woman, and he was a kind of a neutral observer about how things were done. He describes these open forests and the light fires the Indians would set, and the way of life. So every narrative account of the landscape brings its own point of view and its own bias. Whether it's kind of a story of salvation that was a religious pilgrimage, or a story of commerce that we can exploit this land. But there's very few that tell the story from the native perspective. So this is, again, Bound Brook Island, where there was a herring run. This is the Upper Herring River, Upper Bound Brook, actually. And it's pretty much the same story. Here's the Pamette River in about 1910 and then 1992. Center of Truro. I'm sorry. This is the Little Pamette. And just below Cornhill. The railroad passing through in the top photo. And this is, again, there's lots of Truro photos in here. I think for some reason, this is North Pamette Road. The Bog House in Truro in 1912 and 1992. Truro Center. Pilgrim Heights, which was the site of a huge housing development that never happened in Truro because the seashore, really one of the drivers of creating the National Seashore. Again, the Pamette. Provincetown, the original building of the Province Lands Road in about 1915 on the upper left, and 1930, or maybe around 1930 on the upper right, and then the 50s and 60s and the 1990s, showing the revegetation of those dunes, this process of, and the dike, the Hatches Harbor Dike in Provincetown. People often say, well, the world is changing. I've even had people ask me, well, should we leave Cape Cod? Where is the right place to be in this changing world of with climate change and storms and hurricanes and erosion and things? Well, I think all in all, there's a lot of challenges in the Cape, but this is also one of the best places to be. And I'll tell you why. But first of all, the future of Cape Cod is determined by our flood zones. This is something really important. We often get asked, like, well, what areas are most at risk from flooding, from sea level rise? Well, we already know because the FEMA maps are a proxy for the areas that are subject to storms. And those maps, even the old ones, give us a clue as to where we sit in terms of your storm risk. And you might say, well, we've never had that storm yet. But we have a very short time horizon that we can see personally. And the 100-year storm, the 500-year storm is something that still could happen in our lifetimes. So FEMA maps, flood zones are very important to pay attention to. This process of sand movement on the beaches, it's very important not to interrupt that, to allow sand to feed the beaches, to allow erosion to take place. There's other things, our kettle ponds are very fragile, and they've been a catchment for mercury and acid rain, and we've come to terms with that, but we still have nutrients flowing into those ponds from septic systems, sometimes from geese and wildlife, but anything that goes into a pond stays there. And then conditions of warming, as our scientists have already documented that the ponds are warming gradually, that is going to increase the stratification of the pond and trapping those nutrients and having less exchange of oxygen, and it's going to have an effect on what lives there. There's other challenges for the landscape, these exotic species that are really rampant around the Cape, and we have to think about that when we do plantings, that we don't encourage exotic species, that we plant natives. And there's plenty of good landscapers around that know that. And then another thing that people don't think about too much about climate change is that we could have drought conditions. We could have lowered groundwater. The rain recharges our groundwater. Right now we have, it's one of our advantages, one of the sweet spots about Cape Cod is that we have this fantastic, clear, beautiful aquifer that supplies us with drinking water and also provides a landscape with a habitat that encourages, the vernal pools and the wildlife that lives there, the rare plants. So in times of drought, we're going to come closer and closer to our limits around water use and water conservation. So it's just something to be conscious of. But because of our ocean-temperate environment, because of our glacial geology, I think this is a really great place to be. Let's see, for the future. So here's a little snapshot of the FEMA maps of the flood zones. And if you're not familiar with these, you can go to your town hall and find out where your particular favorite places sit in relation to the flood zones. Here's our forests and wetlands. Again, you can't see much at this scale. Here's some of the other parts of our community that live in those places that are dependent on the natural habitats. And here's a kind of a long-term 120-year record of erosion. The red areas are the areas that are eroding the fastest in this particular way of measurement, and the blue areas are areas where the sand's being dropped off and the beaches are growing. It's a little anomalous down there around Nauset Marsh because the sand is coming and going in both directions and moving across the shoreline from Nauset Marsh out to sea. But those barrier spits, are quite dynamic, as you know. And so I recently wrote a review of a book called The Climate Swerve by Robert J. Lifton. He's a nonagenarian resident of New York and Wellfleet, a philosopher, and he wrote a lot about what he called ecocide, which was the nuclear era, and how our lack of awareness of the effects of some of the toxic things that we do on the climate, on the ecology of the planet, and he's adapted that idea to climate change, and he feels that now we're set up for what he calls this climate swerve, where our bringing ourselves closer to our limits will allow us to be more conscious and more aware, and maybe we'll hopefully will spur us to live better, to live more consciously, and to take care of our resources. And the other things on my list here that are part of the Cape Cod way of life to me, that we benefit from these abundant, locally sourced resources like our fish and shellfish, our farmers markets, that we have this abundant groundwater, and that we have a very high level of consciousness of the place that we live in. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. And also, I just want to hold up this book. This is available at the Visitor Center. This is a summary of the geologic forces. It's called Coastal Landforms and Processes of Cape Cod. It's written by Graham Geist of the Center for Coastal Studies, illustrated by me, and it's free and it's also free as an ebook. So check with your Visitor Center, and you can get a copy of this and read about some of the things I talked about. So thanks very much. I'd love to open it to questions, but I guess we'll do that another way.